Welcome everyone to this first event in the new Peers project on reimagining world order. I want to welcome everyone to this World Order Colloquium. My name is John Eikenberry, and this event is the first in what will be a rich array of activities that we will be having over the next several years in this area of reimagining world order. Talks, podcasts, workshops, conferences of one kind or another. I'm also happy to report that I have two postdoc members of the team, Tolia Levshun, who you see on the screen, and Chika Tanuka, who is here as well. Tolia from Princeton University and Chika from Cambridge University, and they will be part of our team over the next several years as we engage in a kind of research community discussion of these big issues of world order. I'll also just say that we have a website that you can click on and you will see the various activities we have planned. We are very pleased to have a podcast, and we will be interviewing various figures, scholars and thinkers in the field of world order studies over the months ahead. I'm very excited to welcome and introduce Professor Rosemary Foot from Oxford University, who will talk about her new book. Rosemary, as most of you know, is a leading scholar of China and the world, China, East Asia, and international relations. She has written books over the years that are focused on these big issues of Asia, China, international institutions, global norms, and the United Nations. She did her PhD at LSE, and she spent many years, much of her career at Oxford at St. Antony's College, and I think she's now emeritus professor at St. Antony's. Congratulations, Rosemary. She's won many awards and accomplishments. She's a member of the British Academy, and she has this new book from Oxford University Press, which is China, the UN, and Human Protection, Beliefs, Power, and Image. And we are going to hear about that today. Rosemary will talk for 40 minutes or so, introducing her work and putting out some of the themes. And then Chika and Tolia will be collecting your questions, which you will be invited to submit through the software on your screen, and we will then pose those questions to Professor Foot after her talk. So this is to be a conversation after her lecture, and we want you to engage with this subject as participants would if they were in a room. So we have to visualize ourselves in a conference room, and across the room you will see Professor Foot, who is coming to the podium, and she will now give her talk. Rosemary, welcome to Princeton, figuratively, and thank you for coming. We look forward to hearing about your book.
Thanks. Thanks so much, John. It's a generous introduction. I only wish I could be there in person. It's such a different experience having to do this on Zoom, but I'm very grateful to be invited to talk about my book, and also to engaging in a Q&A, which will no doubt make me realize I should have written something rather different, but nevertheless, the book is out there, and there's always another one that might come later. So anyway, what I'd like to do from the start is to try to link some of what's in this new book with John's research project, Reimagining World Order. So in that description of the research project, John makes the point that non-Western developing countries led by China, as he puts it, are seeking to put their own imprint on the global system. And I think that we could probably agree that Xi Jinping has made greater efforts in that regard over the last few years. He's spoken explicitly about China leading the reform of the global governance system And he's also talked about actively participating in the formulation of international rules, becoming leaders of the process of global governance changes. And this is quite a difference, actually, from previous Chinese presidencies. I mean, we're used to the idea of Deng Xiaoping, bide your time, hide your brightness. Of course, some of these themes of global governance reform and so on came up under the presidency of Hu Jintao, but nevertheless, the difference is that Xi Jinping is a more ambitious Chinese leader, and this has been elaborated in various statements. So we're in an era then where China is engaged in creating new institutions. We think about the AIIB, for example. It's offering alternative or more familiar global ordering principles, and it's networking in various ways with what I think of as sort of fairly loose influence groups. The like-minded group at the Human Rights Council, for example, the G77 plus China, important in the UN General Assembly and in the C34 grouping, which deals with peace operations. The Belt and Road participants, again, numbers have expanded over the last few years since that initiative was first launched in 2013. But I suggest that the UN is a particularly valuable site for exploring some of these questions. And that's because I think we would probably, or at least most of us, would recognize it as a core institution in the post-1945 world. It tries to reflect a world of shared norms. I mean, that's expressed in the Charter and in various other of its documents and bodies. And it's viewed as a kind of key component of the liberal dimensions of global order. And we see that in its practices, multilateralism, of course, but also the commitment to open debate, transparency via the documentation of meetings, the involvement of non-state actors in its deliberations, absolutely crucial to the efficient working of the United Nations. And all of these factors, among others, reinforce its association with liberal order. And in normative terms, I would argue it's not an original claim, actually, that these normative elements, these liberal elements, have been reinforced in the post-Cold War era. The UN has turned to this focus on human protection. So from the 1990s in particular, the United Nations operated on the basis of a broadening of the concept of security and acknowledged that internal breakdowns of a state's security, as well as large-scale violence directed at individuals, do actually, both of these things, pose potential challenges to international peace and security. We're all familiar with Kofi Annan's important statement in 1999. I'll paraphrase it slightly. And he talked about our contemporary reading of the UN Charter means that we are more than ever conscious of the need to protect individuals from abuse, rather than to protect those who abuse them. And that was an important moment, I think, for the United Nations. And so what you've seen from the late 1990s onwards, the UN trying to incorporate as core norms the idea of the protection of civilians in armed conflict, the responsibility to protect, the idea that governments had a responsibility to protect their peoples from mass atrocity crimes, that governments need to recognize the differentiated negative consequences of conflict for women and children, that they need to respond and react to widespread use of conflict-related sexual violence. Turning to the Human Rights Council, which replaced the Human Rights Commission in 2006, that council requires all states under the Universal Periodic Review process to account for their triumphs and their lapses, particularly their lapses in human rights protections. And where they lapse, to actually seek remedies. And since China has decided, as I started by saying, it has decided to increase its influence in world politics and in particular in the United Nations, including the devotion of new resources to the United Nations, then the study of the relationship between China and the UN seems to me to be a particularly important one to engage in. and it helps us navigate questions of interest to IR scholars, but also to policymakers. So the sorts of questions we've been looking at: how might China be resculpting or reshaping international organizations from within, if at all? Should we view China as a revisionist, a reformist, or a status quo country? The categories, again, that appeared in Avery Goldstein's latest article in International Security. Does Beijing represent a challenge to liberal dimensions of global order? And if so, what kind of challenge and what degree of challenge? Is Beijing making a world safe for autocracy, as Jessica Chen Weiss has written about? Or if we play off the title of John's new book, to what extent does that make it a world less safe for democracy? John's project also is going to explore the kind of international order that rising states might want. Well, in my view and the view of others, China has risen, and I think is beginning to make this clear. And it's making it clear within the United Nations. Turning to the book in a bit more detail, all research projects begin with a research puzzle, and mine had both why and how questions at the root. So I was drawn into this because I was thinking about, why has China become more deeply involved in the work of the UN when the UN has moved beyond, to some degree at least, its Westphalian principles? It's moved into this era when it's focusing on human protection. So when I thought about focusing on human protection, it's because it's an idea that invites normative contestation of a pretty fundamental kind, for a government that's privileged the security of the state and the political regime above that of the security of the individual. So human protection appeals to universalist, cosmopolitan principles, implies imposing limits on state sovereignty, the sort of thing that Hedley Bull called solidarism versus pluralism. So the UN has expressed and advanced this global norm of human protection when China, as a consequence of its increasingly influential role in world politics, has the capacity to project its beliefs in the value of state-based pluralism and acceptance of diversity and difference. So my next research question was, well, how is China working within international institutions like the UN in order to, if you like, protect its underlying beliefs, as well as contribute as a responsible great power, as it would define itself in the global system? If I say something quickly about my approach to this, as some of you will know, sort of social approaches to IR have influenced the intellectual framing of the project. So I'm sympathetic to approaches that explore the social construction of reality, the social context in which decisions are made and taken. And so that explains something of the subtitle of my book, where I'm looking at the mutually interdependent relationship among beliefs, power, and image where China is concerned. And when I focus on power, yes, I am interested in China's increasing material power, but I'm also interested in the way that translates into increased social influence. So I'm interested in power as leverage, but I'm also interested in power as the ability to set agendas, power as the ability to gain non-coerced followership, and in particular to shift the meanings of dominant global norms towards an interpretation that's somewhat closer to those interpretations that the state believes validates its own positions. And when I try to explore the idea of international image, particularly this image as responsible great power, I argue that it's important to it both domestically and internationally, and it shades its perspectives and the positions that it takes. Again, looking at domestic ideological beliefs, I argue that those beliefs actually cohere if you look at them over several different phases of China's political progression. They coalesce around the idea, if I put it in a rather benign formulation at the moment, that a governing authority's success requires strong centralizing political institutions, domestic social harmony, recognition of the larger social value of economic development. And I try to argue in the book that uncovering that interrelationship, beliefs, power, image, helps to highlight the dynamic nature of Beijing's policy responses and helps us understand how China has responded to the UN as it's attempted to move towards a post-Westphalian order. And what I'm hoping is that the empirical work in the book shows that China's growing power has been used in service of the firmer articulation of its ideological beliefs, together with an effort to reconstitute what it means to be a responsible great power in the global system. So by operating as an engaged actor, by engaging in public debate within this institution, and within an environment that's pretty sympathetic to its arguments, it can potentially reconstitute what is understood by responsible international behavior. Now, the broad findings of the research are that China is offering an alternative set of understandings, an alternative to dominant UN understandings, at least as those understandings are reflected in the Secretariat and among some member states. How best to give effect to human protection, China has some different ideas. And I'm going to try and represent that in pictorial form. So I'm going to try and share the screen here to bring up my PowerPoints. I hope that that's worked. Yeah, and this is the straightforward UN three-pillar structure, very familiar to all of us within the UN Charter, within the sort of institutional, the sub-institutional structure of the UN itself. But as I say, I'm suggesting that China has an alternative, and that looks, to me anyway, it looks something like this, a triadic model. That triadic model has been expressed more forcefully, I would suggest, since the start of the Xi Jinping presidency, and it emphasizes the interrelationship among economic development, the strong state, social stability, on the understanding that you're more likely to get conflict, prevent conflict, to resolve conflict, and that will help to protect peoples. China, by the way, doesn't refer to this as a triadic model. That's my idea. What you do get in the literature, in the scholarly literature, you get the idea of developmental peace. In some Xi Jinping statements and other Chinese official statements, you get statements such as you can't have development without security, you can't have security without development, and you can't have any of these things without an unstable society, and so on. If you look at this model, obviously it's downplaying the significance of human rights when you compare it with the UN three-pillar structure. It's also downgrading an independent role for civil society, encapsulated within the idea of social stability. And I'm going to put this in slightly different tabular form now, another slide, and just draw out a couple of concepts, sovereignty and security. And I'm trying to suggest, I'm trying to point out some of the differences from the Chinese position and the dominant UN position with respect to these two concepts. But I also want to flag at this point that the heading United Nations in this table is in some senses hiding the complexity of what the United Nations actually is. So the table is suggesting that Beijing is attempting to undermine support for the UN's three-pillar structure, that the Secretariat in particular continues to advance. But Beijing's constituency of support for its own model, particularly among developing countries, has become quite large. In part, yes, because of use of its economic leverage or because of economic largesse, but also as a result of its demonstrated economic success, sustaining high growth rates over several decades until very recently, of course, bringing some 800 million Chinese out of poverty, and economic organs within the United Nations constantly remind us that China was so important to the UN reaching the Millennium Development Goals in 2015. And there's also an alignment in views among China and a number of UN member states about the dangers of an intrusive UN agenda, seen in the way that human protection can operate. So it's vital to note that Beijing doesn't always have to act. There can be an alignment of values between China and many UN member states, which immediately raises questions about what kind of normative order the United Nations actually represents, and the extent to which the post-Cold War, post-Westphalian framing has actually taken root. So it raises questions about the extent to which Beijing genuinely represents a challenge to this component of global order. I want to turn to some of the specifics of policy across the various dimensions of human protection. And I'll just move to the next slide. The state is obviously predominant in the China model rather than the individual, as I've said, and it promotes this through narrowing the concept of what represents a genuine threat to international peace and security, and therefore attempting to restrain what should come onto the UN Security Council agenda. Not suggesting it's always successful, it clearly isn't, but attempting to make that argument. So moving the evidence away from, moving the focus away from evidence of mass atrocity crimes inside states or what could be considered civil wars, away to some degree from the emphasis on protecting civilians towards firmer support for the government in power. So for example, at the early stage of the Syrian conflict, that devastating conflict, China made the statement, this is a civil war and therefore it's not the business of the Security Council. It's not affecting neighbouring states and so should not actually come onto the Security Council's agenda. Of course, it couldn't keep that argument going as the years went by and this conflict expanded. But that's the kind of thing. It rejects, whenever it can, the informal working groups that have been set up to help advance the human protection agenda conceptually and practically. It doesn't take part in these informal working groups. It argues that, again, the Security Council is the body, the main body, and should remain so. It makes plain that the UN Security Council basically should be considered as an enabler or supporter of the government in power. It should provide constructive assistance, but must respect the sovereignty of the country concerned. That would be a typical statement. Host state consent is really at the forefront. And when there is evidence of some form of atrocity crime having been committed inside a state, then domestic judicial institutions are to be the ones to address the question and to seek redress. And China tries to link the status and developmental legs of its model, again, very firmly. So if you discuss within the United Nations capacity building for fragile states, this becomes a development issue, one that should involve ECOSOC or the UNDP, rather than the Security Council. It shouldn't, again, statements to the effect that there's too much emphasis on security sector reform, building inclusive institutions, representative political institutions, rule of law, and so on. If you turn to something like the responsibility to protect, and it has a 3-pillar implementation structure. China puts the emphasis on pillar 1. It's the state's responsibility to protect its population from mass atrocity crimes. When you look at pillar 2 and Chinese statements with regard to pillar 2 is a pillar that focuses on international assistance designed to build state capacities to help the state in question prevent atrocity crimes from occurring. Now, in that instant, Beijing again argues that it's the state in question that should determine what is needed in that regard. With regard to pillar 3 on an international community response, were a state to be found to be manifestly failing, in protecting its population. Again, China emphasizes caution. It has to go through the Security Council. It has to be on a case-by-case basis. But its emphasis is very much on Pillar 1 and to some degree on Pillar 2. When China turns to discuss causes of conflict, conflict prevention, conflict resolution, very often it avoids the term conflict prevention and actually talks about preventive diplomacy. But in its view, again, what it emphasizes is that conflict is bound up with poverty and underdevelopment. When it addresses something like the Women, Peace and Security agenda, it turns that into a women's rights and a development issue. So women's rights are the prerogative of the government in power, in China's view, or at most something that should interest the Commission on the Status of Women. When it talks about women's empowerment, which is a key feature of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, that again, it argues, should be promoted through the development arm of the UN, ECOSOC. International human rights diplomacy at the Human Rights Council. Again, important developments here. Beijing has come to promote more vigorously two norms that challenge the focus on the universality and indivisibility of human rights. So Xi Jinping, in a speech in Geneva in January 2017 at the Palais des Nations, affirmed sovereign equality as the most important norm governing state-to-state relations, and rights, again in that speech, are turned into a development question. China has saved the world because it has developed and has not exported its peoples and its problems in any way. In June 2017 and in years subsequent to that, China introduced for the very first time resolutions at the Human Rights Council. There was a draft entitled "The Contribution of Development to the Enjoyment of All Human Rights." I was able to see an early draft of that. China was in the end forced to compromise on some of the language of that resolution. The early draft was very explicit in talking about development as a foundational right from which other rights might flow, and an argument about cultural diversity and the importance of recognizing cultural diversity, which raises fundamental questions, I think, about universal principles. Thinking about the social stability leg of China's model, and this is particularly plain after the Arab Spring 2011, China's issued a number of statements that emphasize the duty of governments to maintain public security and public order, the need to curb the use of social media, and it's tried to restrict the NGO role in various of the UN setting, particularly actually at the Human Rights Council. Again, NGO, the statement is that NGOs that might be helping out in peace operations, providing particular kinds of services, they need to be guided by the government in power, to quote China. And it often, in the human rights context anyway, casts doubt on the impartiality of NGOs. It's argued strongly to try to control their representation in the UN, in various of the UN bodies. It labels the NGO approach generally, and particularly again in the Human Rights Council, as confrontational, when what the atmosphere needs to be in that Human Rights Council is cooperative. It also argues that their information, which the Human Rights Council, of course, relies on to a large degree, it argues that their information actually lacks credibility. Well, how successful has China been in promoting this agenda and approach? I think there are sort of broad UN-related reasons, and there are sort of reasons that relate more directly to China itself. If I turn to the UN-related first of all, and sort of slightly more diffuse reasons, it's because of greater attention, I think, the success has relied to some degree because of the greater attention by UN Secretaries General, the Secretariat, the UN specialized agencies, to the relationship between underdevelopment, conflict and human protection. again from the late 1990s onwards. So in 2003, I think it was, the World Bank issued a very important report on the causes of civil wars. And in that report, it put great emphasis, again, on the role of underdevelopment in causing conflict and also in promoting a recurrence of conflict. The other element is that there have been various setbacks and difficulties in trying to enact this very complex human protection agenda. There have been failures. There have been numerous failures. Just think what it's like to try to provide protection for the thousands of civilians that often get caught up in armed conflict. Places like Mali and South Sudan, tens of thousands of civilians that need protection, and a UN that's relatively under-resourced in terms of peacekeeping troops. There's been criticism of the so-called Christmas tree mandates that are behind the peace operations that have been launched. So it's often said that they're far too complex, they involve far too many tasks, and too few resources. So the UN over the years, as this human protection agenda has unfolded, has been looking for better ways of doing things. It's looking for a better understanding of what to do and how to do it. And then China's aided because of the result of the relative decline in Western influence. I mean, this is obviously to do with the diffusion of power in the global system, but there's also very specific things like the diminution of the Western troop presence in UN peace operations in the last few years. And then we come to the United States, the denial of the benefits of multilateralism, particularly associated, of course, with the Trump administration, the disavowal that bodies like the UN can further any of Washington's security objectives. And we've seen, although the United States remains as the largest contributor to the UN budget, it's cut that budget back, and it's now seriously behind with its UN dues. And of course, it's pulled out of various UN bodies like the Human Rights Council, UNESCO, World Health Organization. Many of you will probably have read President Trump's statement yesterday about the UN in its 75th year, a year allegedly of celebration. It's a complete, really, disdain, I think, for the United Nations and the way it has tried to operate. There's also China's increased contribution of resources, which of course stands against this disengagement by the United States. So in 2015, Xi Jinping announced the establishment of a 10-year, $1 billion China-UN Peace and Development Trust Fund. The management committee, by the way, is largely made up of Chinese nationals. And that fund is to be used to support particular projects of interest to the UN Secretariat and to China itself. And it also is linked with the Sustainable Development Goals. China also said that it would join the new UN Peacekeeping Capability Readiness System, and it would establish an 8,000 troop peacekeeping standby force. It also offered the African Union a sum of money to help the establishment of an African standby force. All of these elements have come to pass, certainly not spent anything like the 1 billion that it promised, but that was over a 10-year period. But it spent some money on projects that the Secretariat has wanted to see funded. And of course, as we know, it tells us all the time, it offers more peacekeeping troops than all other P5 members combined. The Belt and Road Initiative has also made quite significant headway within the United Nations. So Guterres, the Secretary General, has encouraged a strong relationship between the BRI and the Sustainable Development Goals, not least because he's extremely fearful of the UN's ability to reach the completion of those goals by the date of 2030. Goodness knows what he must be thinking in light of COVID 2019. And there's a final thing, which I didn't put on the slide, but it's Beijing often has positive relations with African governments, and that's the continent where most of the UN peace operations actually take place. And in many ways, the fact of China's participation it's perceived in the UN as beneficial to the legitimate enactment of some of those peace operations. So if China supports a peace operation in an African country, in some senses, then that UN Security Council role is additionally validated. Turning to more direct China-related reasons, obviously China's used its economic centrality to many states to forge alignments and voting coalitions. We see that in a number of instances. It also uses discourse of various kinds to promote the successes of its own model. It often stages exhibitions, it invites party leaders from other states to learn about its political economic model. When I was visiting the UN to do some of my interviews, on one occasion there was a special exhibition in the UN shop, which was very much focused on China and its contributions and so on. But it also, of course, works with other post-colonial states similarly concerned about the interventionist aspects of a post-Westphalian UN. So Beijing can get the voting coalitions together in bodies like the Human Rights Council, for example, because there is, again, similar areas of concern. So that's what I meant earlier when I was talking about non-coerced followership. Let me come back to the main screen. I don't want to leave you with the impression that the UN hasn't shown some normative resilience. It has, that there isn't some pushback, even among certain kinds of member states and as well as among the Secretariat. So on that, what I was talking about earlier about the relationship between development, conflict and human protection. So UN reports often stress the necessity for sustainable development in raising levels of human protection, but they also accord in these reports a central role for what we would probably term good governance. So Goal 16, for example, of the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goal Agenda emphasizes that sustainable development requires justice and accountable political institutions. There was something of a fight to get that particular goal as part of the 17 overall elements of the SDGs, but it was inserted, and not just because of the role of democratic countries in trying to get that element in, but also because of a number of states pushed very hard, states like Liberia, for example. And the UN World Bank 2018 study called Pathways for Peace, I'm just going to quote a very short part of that. It argues in that particular report, growth and poverty alleviation are crucial, but alone will not suffice. Needed also are inclusive solutions through dialogue, adapted macro policies, institutional reform in core state functions, redistributive policies. So much more of a political economic model coming through there. It's also very striking that when China has used its vetoes in the UN Security Council recently, a new development for it, of course, jointly with Russia, it hasn't vetoed alone. During the Syrian crisis, those vetoes have attracted criticism. And it's also the case that it's unusual for China and Russia to attract other elements of support from within the Security Council among the elected members. We wouldn't expect the P3 to support the P2, but you might expect 2, 3, 4 members of the elected members of the Security Council to support China and Russia. They don't often do so. You might have one, but so there is something where there's some sort of boundary that's difficult to elucidate in many ways, but there's some sort of boundary that is worth exploring when we think about ideas of the UN and normative resilience. And just one final word on R2P. Again, China did not want R2P to become part of the General Assembly's formal agenda. It wanted it to stay part of an informal discussion that happens once a year. But it was unable to prevent an overwhelming vote in support, actually, for transferring that to the UN General Assembly's formal agenda. And so, and China is not always able to protect its closer allies from criticism. I think about Myanmar and the Rohingya issue, and the Gambia's successful attempt to take that matter to the International Court of Justice, or the fact that North Korea has been subject to damning reports from Human Rights Council mandated commissions of inquiry. So again, there are these interesting boundary issues that are worth reflecting on. Probably I should have reflected on rather more in the book itself. So what can we say then? What are the conclusions that I try to draw from this study? Is China shaping the human protection order? If so, to what degree? My conclusions are not straightforward, unfortunately. It's Beijing, as you've sort of gathered, I think, it's both aided and it's constrained. It's aided because the United Nations itself represents more than one kind of order. It's within the Secretariat, among its membership, among the Charter, and in its everyday behaviour. So it's very difficult to label China revisionist, reformist, status quo within this complex UN setting. The setting itself contains a range of conflicting normative elements. We're all familiar, of course, with Article 2.7, pledging non-intervention in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state, contrasted with the Charter's powerful statement calling for universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms, and so on. But as I say, China is constrained, there is pushback. The UN does have a post-Westphalian identity, dating especially from the post-Cold War era, promoted energetically still in the Secretariat and by some UN member states. Civil society remains vibrant in many of the societies in which China operates. Research on the effectiveness of UN's peace operations underlines how important it is to strengthen local knowledge and to search out a range of opinion within societies in order to be able to reduce and manage conflict, again, which suggests an important role for civil society groups. Again, to reiterate my point, the most direct of Beijing's challenges, I think, has come in the area of human rights, particularly this idea of development as the primary basic human rights from which others might flow, and the attempt to turn the Human Rights Council into something like a technical capacity building body. And it's in this area, I think, that China has more vigorously engaged in what Zhang Yongjin and Barry Buzan have described as public reasoning as an engaged actor rather than an outlier, and with some level of success, some element of non-coerced followership, especially among those constituencies that are concerned about the issue area of human rights and R2P. So what kind of UN, final point, what kind of UN would the People's Republic of China prefer to see? Were it to acquire the increased authority within the UN that it seeks, especially the acquisition of higher level positions within the Secretariat dealing with international peace and security, we might see a UN that is reminiscent of the 1970s or the 1980s, perhaps. And that body then would appear, even more than is the case today, perhaps as an interstate governance mechanism where individual governments requiring assistance decide on priority. The international community acts as an enabler of the government in power. And it's a pretty minimalist, I think, and pluralist state-based conception of global order. So you reduce the international community, a phrase that China uses, to a resource rather than a partner. And in my view, that overplays the notions that choices determined at the central governmental level will resolve issues associated with state fragility or benefit the state's wider society. And I think it also sidesteps the problem that if you're going to try and persuade international actors to agree to commit resources, then this means that they want a role. They will require a larger role than Beijing's formulation implies. A final paragraph, returning to reimagining world order, and I'll be particularly interested to get your reactions to this. So China's vision in many ways appears as something rather familiar, rather conservative. As I said earlier, the categories revisionist, reformist, status quo, in some senses could all be said to be in play in different parts of the UN system. And in part, I wonder whether that's because the post-Westphalian project of the 1990s and onwards has not carried enough of the UN member states with it. Thanks very much. I hope that wasn't too long for a Zoom presentation, and I look forward to your comments and the Q&A that will follow now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. That was fantastic and much to think about and discuss. I'll turn it over to my colleagues to conduct the Q&A, and then I'll jump in when it's appropriate.
Thank you, John. And thank you, Rosemary, also for your presentation. It was very interesting. We have a couple of questions already lined up, so I will start putting them to you right away. In the meantime, I want to remind our audience that the Q&A is completely anonymous. Feel free to submit your questions. They will be put to Rosemary privately. Your names will not be shared during this webinar. The first question that we have, Rosemary, is this. How far is the Chinese model you outlined particularly unique to China? The emphasis on sovereignty, for instance, is massively evident in Russia's approach also. It is, of course, interestingly appears in Trump's UN speeches too.
Yep, that's a very good question. It has. I think it's not unique to China at one level anyway, because in a sense I'm trying to make that point that it does appeal to those that are equally concerned about intrusiveness of a UN human protection agenda. You're absolutely right that Russia also aligns with China in terms of a worldview that emphasizes very much the sovereignty question. I think the difference actually is the development social stability leg of all of this. China is particularly, I mean, of course, again, Russia and other states are leery, wary of civil society groups and so on. But China puts it within this kind of domestic social stability framing. And I don't think they do. I mean, I think other states put it in the perspective of suggesting that in some senses, these are bodies that do not carry the legitimacy and the representational nature that is required in order to respond to some of the greatest challenges that states and societies face, that has to be a state prerogative and so on. China, on the other hand, is really arguing that if you have domestic social stability, then that leads to the kind of environment that will attract investment, that will attract the support of the domestic population, that will lead to the kinds of outcomes that is a kind of a self-reinforcing element within that. And then the emphasis on development, obviously, is absolutely, and a particular form of development. I mean, I didn't really talk about that, but it's a form of development that emphasizes very much, you know, the kind of the infrastructural elements of that. And again, it's very much a top-down approach in deciding what needs to be developed and where resources need to be going. So yes, I can see alignments in worldviews between China and many other states in the system for some of the reasons I've outlined. But I also think there are particular elements that, you know, derive from China's history, culture, political system and so on that make it somewhat separate.
Thank you. We also have another question. How do you square the strong Chinese emphasis on sovereignty, non-intervention and sovereign equality with a seemingly increasing demand for primacy in its own neighborhood?
Yeah, that's also a very good question, and something I've actually written about. There's a sense in which these things are in huge tension in terms of Chinese foreign policy. So you're absolutely right. I mean, whether or not, I mean, we'll leave it, take it at face value that it's seeking primacy within its own neighborhood. We discuss that perhaps separately, but you're within its own neighborhood. Of course, it's extraordinarily protective of its own sovereign claims, whether that's East China Sea, South China Sea, the China-India border, whatever, extraordinarily protective of those claims. And it argues, you know, that you cannot expect China to swallow the bitter fruit of that would be required were it to give up those sovereign claims. So that's extraordinarily difficult for it to finesse, in my view. And I think this is one of the problems with it attempting to play a leading role within its own neighborhood. In other words, it comes over as primacy, it comes over as dominance. It doesn't really come over as a more agreed consensual element that in order to be a hegemonic player within its own neighborhood would require something softer. I wonder, actually, I was doing a bit of work on this today. If you just give me 1 second, I just want to quote Lee Hsien Loong, a Singaporean prime minister, because I think he puts it quite well. And I was just looking at this earlier today. Okay, so this is a statement that he made at the Shangri-La Dialogue 2019, I think it's, and he talks about the frictions that arise between China and its neighbors. And he argues that China should resolve these disputes peacefully through diplomacy and compromise, rather than force or the threat of force, while giving weight to the core interests and rights of other countries. Then over time, this is the bit that I find particularly interesting, over time, it will build its reputation as a responsible and benevolent power, note the use of the word benevolent, as a responsible and benevolent power that need not be feared. Instead, China will be respected as a power that can be relied on to support a stable and peaceful region. So leaders like Lee Hsien Loong are actually asking for a concept of Chinese hegemony that is one that is consensually based. And I think really, to some degree, they're playing off the view of the United States' role in the Asia-Pacific region, particularly again in the post-Cold War era. I'm not talking about actually the current period, but in that post-Cold War period where it was depicted by a large swathe of the leadership in the Asia-Pacific region as a benign hegemon that had no territorial ambitions, that actually provided a kind of a public good role. And I think in a sense, Lee Hsien Loong is trying to encourage China to think of itself in that way. But of course, that's extraordinarily difficult when it has these sovereignty claims, it has a nationalist public, it has a commitment to restoring national unity, territorial integrity of China. So it's a very difficult, these are very difficult policies to try to advance at the same time, in my view.
Thank you. We have another question here. You seem to attribute China's recent involvements in the United Nations, for example, the promotion of its own model, the triadic model, to Xi Jinping's leadership. I was wondering, apart from Xi's personal political ambition, is there a deeper level explanation? Any structural accounts, for example, international level explanations for the key changes you highlight in your book?
Let me think about that. Well, yeah, I mean, in the sense that Xi Jinping's interpretation of China's material power position is a different one. In other words, the structural condition, obviously, particularly after the global financial crisis, is such that China has emerged as a close contender of the United States in terms of various indices, various ways in which you might measure power. And alongside that comes a perception that in light of events such as the global financial crisis and this redistribution of relative power, that China is at the juncture where it actually should be promoting its particular ideas more forcefully. I found, examining these ideas of the triadic model, there's enormous consistency actually and continuity of view about the importance of these ideas of development and stability and the idea that you reach development with security and security with development. You can find numerous statements. The difference is, I think, that China is now attempting to act on those rather more directly, and to act within the institution, to have a larger voice and to play a larger role in shaping the way in which those things are thought about. So I agree with the thrust of the question. There is a kind of a structural change which is related to China's material power, but it's the interpretation of that material power change that I find particularly interesting and leads me to single out Xi Jinping in particular.
Rosemary, can I jump in? And I have a question that kind of builds on the last one and on the first one, I guess. And that is, in some ways, the short version of the question is, are you making an argument that's consistent with Weiss's argument about a world safe for autocracy? Or to put it differently, is what China is doing in the United Nations driven, in your view, by an attempt to create a more congenial normative environment for Xi's regime to survive and be legitimate? Is this a regime level impulse to protect the Communist Party and the particular model of China? Or is this more something that can be explained by a developing country, a large developing country that's seeking to protect its sovereignty and its role in a world that's dominated by Western states? It's not so much about autocracy; it's about geopolitics and creating space for it in security and international affairs more generally. And then I have a follow-up.
Okay, I mean, obviously these things are very difficult to pin down in such an opaque society. I mean, if the second part of your question about developing country protecting sovereignty, a geopolitical issue, that this is sort of a larger view of what might be happening. I think that at the moment, at least, you see China trying to link its perspective with that larger view, arguing that, the developing world in general, I mean, there are a number of statements to this effect, the developing world in general would be more secure, would be in a better position, the system itself would be more just, were it to take on some of the attributes that China has been putting forward. But if I think about the sort of the dominant causal elements here, then yes, I do think that it's actually trying to make a world that's less threatening to its own political regime. I mean, I think, China is particularly concerned. That's why it makes these statements about, I think, civilizational diversity, cultural diversity in a sense, because it's always been so alarmed and dismayed about dividing states into rogue states and acceptable states. So this kind of civilizational discourse allows China to make the point that in some senses we're all equally meritorious, and you have no right to categorize me as somehow outside the system or subjecting me to forms of constraint or sanction of various kinds. So, and I think that's, that animates a lot of what's going on here. And this sense that, I mean, look how concerned it's been about the color revolutions and things of that kind. Think about, I mentioned the Arab Spring. inside China, they had this moment where there were people talking about the Jasmine Revolution and so on. And the society, I mean, the authorities immediately reacted to that, and the public security was out on the streets in a really big way. So I do think you have, again, this very strange combination in China of a sense of vulnerability as well as a sense of power and being at an important historical juncture in order to express that power. Yeah, I hope
that's helpful. And I just wanted to follow up on that. And it's sort of how you see the broader global struggle at an ideological level unfolding in the context of your work. Because you could kind of embed your story in different larger global stories about the rise of China, the decline of the West, the struggle between different ideological global positions. And so the question is really, if you were to look down at 30,000 feet at the struggle over norms in the United Nations, you've told the story of China versus the kind of Kofi Annan era development of new ideas about responsibility and security, and China's pushing back on that and reclaiming norms of sovereignty and emphasizing development over human rights. What are the alignments and coalitions globally that are swirling around these two positions? It's not a story of China versus the United States, for sure. It's a really the modern UN, as it evolved after the Cold War, versus China is kind of more the kind of axis of the conflict you're describing, or the norm contestation. Is that right? Or how would you map this norm contestation on the larger world? Is the global South on one side and Europe and the United States on the other? Or is it more complicated than that, and there are layers of coalitions that come and go, and it's not really a kind of conflict that shakes the world in a kind of deep ideological way? Or is it? So how would you map it onto the larger global system?
I mean, I started the talk by referring to what are called loose influence groups. In other words, not sort of firm alignments or firm alliance, certainly not alliances. So not a kind of, there's certainly not a Cold War framing, what I'm suggesting here. I'm suggesting a degree of malleability, flexibility, if you like, if I look down on it from 30,000 feet, and a struggle, you're right, between the parts of the UN and this particular Chinese perspective, and a particularly difficult struggle because China can be flexible. China is offering resources to the United Nations. China is concerned that it be viewed as a responsible great power within the Security Council, deserving of its seat and so on. And so there is both a complexity that China itself introduces, and there's a complexity because the UN itself, as I said, is made up of different constituencies. I mean, I'm not sure where this will go, and one hesitates to be firm about this in light of the kind of situation that we're now in. I mean, if you think of something like the Belt and Road Initiative, now as a kind of another venue for thinking about the questions that you're raising now, there are those that write about Belt and Road that say, oh, it's all over the place and, they're never going to be able to do it. And anyway, everybody's doing their own thing and so on. And so it's not going to be this great influence network and so on that China is kind of proposing here, this connectivity. There are others that are arguing that what's really important about this moment of the BRI is that China is not talking about integration with the current system. It's talking about connectivity with particular states and peoples, connectivity from a Chinese hub. And that's a very different framing. So many things are up in the air, as we know, and that's exacerbated obviously by the health pandemic and the economic consequences of that. So many of the states that have worked with China now find themselves heavily indebted, extraordinarily concerned about food security, about their ability to withstand this blow and so on, casting back, 20 years of development sort of wiped out the window. In that kind of environment, we just can't really frame this sort of steady march forward of a particular view of what China will be able to achieve and what it is actually being asked to do by a number of its close allies and so on. So I mean, I know that's probably unsatisfactory, but it is an extraordinarily difficult moment it's almost like there are pathways. I mean, if I was going to write about this, I think I would talk about different scenarios, actually, and I think that would be probably the best I could offer. In some senses, there's no sort of galvanization on the part of the European states or the West, or a different sort of presidency in the United States. There would be different kinds of political changes that I would want to look at, but I'd also want to look at some of the economic consequences of the COVID-19 health pandemic and what that is actually doing to the notion of China as such a centrally important economic actor in world politics.
I have more questions, but I want to turn things over to my colleagues for their questions or any other questions from the audience.
We've just received a question on the BRI. How do you think BRI is distinguishable from 19th century European style imperialism?
Well, that's an interesting one. Well, I mean, I think there are different sets of ideas that are behind it. I mean, there are the notion of, if you like, of a kind of an interdependent global economy where certain categories of states and peoples, in some senses, require certain economic public goods that China is offering in order to bring them to some particular level of modernity, if you like. In other words, it's a very different set of motives, I think, to the relationship between the metropole and the periphery that was associated with the imperial era, where it was about trying to gain profits and so on. I think this is projected on the part of recipients of Belt and Road investment, but also on the part of China as something that will, if you like, raise boats. Now, whether in the end it will, and whether or not China would use that form of connectivity for recognizable leverage aims is another question. In that sense, maybe it certainly shares some of the hierarchical dimensions of imperial orders, but I don't think it necessarily implies that entire imperial mindset. I mean, I know that, again, those that actually study China talk about this as being actually an all under heaven concept rather than a kind of a individual state relationship concept. Again, I'm not entirely convinced by that particular framing. I don't know, John, you've thought about these issues more than I have. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I don't know enough about the particular cases to know how to compare it to empire. Obviously, there is you were talking about kind of a hub and spoke. There is a kind of imperial architecture to it, and then it's kind of questions about bargains, reciprocity, exit opportunities, in some sense, contained the various relationships are. Tolia, you think about this a lot as well.
Yes, we actually have a follow-up to that question about the nature of imperialism at the time. Rosemary, I want to put that to you as a follow-up, but then I also have a question of my own afterwards. So the follow-up is the British and French formulations of imperialism and empire in the 19th century were fundamentally about raising boats. Is that not true?
I'm not a student of empire, but my reading of it would be somewhat different from that. It would be much more in terms of, I mean, whatever the rhetoric that surrounded it, the notion that you were actually that the imperial relationship was one that was of economic benefit for the metropole was a crucial element in that, and certainly in generating those forms of relationships. That's what I would see as being crucial to the British and the French advancement of empire, as well as obviously the idea of advancement of the idea of a civilizing mission and all of those other things associated with that. But nevertheless, I don't see that kind of framing. I mean, the actuality of the Belt and Road doesn't really correspond to that particular framing at the moment. I mean, China is obviously not particularly benefiting from the kinds of investments that it's made. It's not particularly presenting this as a coherent framework. And there is a great deal to the argument, actually, that it's finding extraordinarily difficult to advance the individual parts of this agenda because of the kind of the conditions within the countries themselves, both because they're fragile, but also at the other end of the scale, because a number of these countries involved in Belt and Road are actually pretty consolidated states as well. I mean, if you think of some of the partners in Eastern Europe and the like, as well as some of the partners in Asia itself. So, you know, you've got a different kind of state system. It's not one that's kind of in this highly subordinated role that I would associate with the imperial era. But I'm perfectly willing to admit that this is not my forte. More reading needs to be done, Foote. Make a note.
Thank you. I want to ask you a question about whether China's project for the United Nations in transforming the international institutional landscape, moving it in a direction that makes the world safe for autocracy, so to speak, whether that's a contributor to international stability or instability in the present circumstances. And this really touches on your invocation of solidarism and pluralism, categories which are foundational to English school thinking about international relations. Hedley Bull, of course, famously in The Anarchical Society, argued that in the context of the 1970s and the 1960s, a pluralist world was fundamentally a more stable world. And solidarism, in effect, reached too far in the context of that state system. Now, whether or not we agree with Bull's judgment, it is true that in the 1990s, many people seized on the moment of American unipolarity to advance a more solidarist vision of the international system. That's where we had the movement toward personal responsibility under international law with R2P and so forth, all the elements that you discussed in your presentation. But now that the international system is shifting away from that unipolar moment toward a more multipolar or perhaps a bipolar system in the long run, do you think that China's project for a pluralist United Nations is fundamentally a source of stability or instability in the medium term?
I mean, I think it could be. I mean, obviously, when I think about the pluralist world orders, I think of you know, the elements of consensus that are at the root of that thinking. Of course, sovereign equality of nations is an extraordinarily important norm, that it generates stability. It generates a sense of protection. So even though in some senses, well, in many senses, it's a fiction, but nevertheless, it's a very important shield for a number of states that feel vulnerable and so on. So in that sense, yes, I think it's potentially a stabilizing element. My concern is, I think, how far you push it. I mean, what bothers me, I think, about the Chinese position particularly is this idea that the kind of the host state determines everything. And if the host state, you know, rather than, you know, there's very little give in this system as far as I can see it. And it's also extraordinarily difficult to row back these ideas. I mean, there are, you know, we do have an international legal framework that focuses on genocide and other elements of humanitarian law and so on. So you're always going to get that, you're going to get that struggle. So you're going to get that element of instability anyway. But if I'm not sounding contradictory here, but I do accept the sort of the framing of your question. I've been puzzling quite a lot about the extent to which the 1990s pushed things just way too far. I mean, I found, you know, Kofi Annan extremely inspirational person and speaker and so on, and many of the things that came out of his secretary generalship. But I sometimes do wonder that, I mean, I think I've come to the position where it pushed it beyond the consensus in many ways. And so something, particularly after things like, you know, 2003 intervention in Iraq, and then 2011 Libya and so on, you know, this has really sort of galvanized the view that this has gone too far. So there is this sense in which some kind of pullback is probably in order. My worry is that the Chinese pullback is just going too far, and a lot of things that need doing at the global cooperative level somehow or other will get left to one side. And that's an interesting paradox, actually, because on the one hand, this means in some senses, if the United Nations doesn't deal with some of these issues, you know, climate change or refugee displacement or global health pandemics, you know, the whole range of collective problems that we face, if it doesn't deal well with that and collectively with that, then it becomes less relevant in world politics. It already suffers from questions of relevancy. And yet China, you know, has put its eggs in this UN basket. I mean, it's constantly saying, you know, it's the most important, authoritative, representative organization in the global system, and it must be supported. So there is a bit of a paradox for me between the idea of irrelevancy if we go too far down the Chinese route.
Thank you.
Chika, do you?
Yeah, Rosemary, if I could also ask you a question. I want to get your thoughts on China's activities at the regional level as through various regional fora. How does that compare with China's work through UN, and perhaps more generally, how do the mechanisms for change in regional orders, do you think, compare with possible transformations at the larger world order level? Yeah,
I mean, as you know, China is involved in a large number of regional groupings, and it takes the regional level pretty seriously these days, and it tries quite hard to link the United Nations with regional organizations. So it's often drawing on regional institutions as a way of as a kind of force multiplier for the United Nations when it lacks resources, or when China feels that its positions, the UN positions, lacks some legitimacy. So China will turn to the regional, what does the regional organization think on this? And will often align its voting pattern with that regional organization. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of the African Union or Latin American states or whatever. So there is this close sort of relationship in China's perspective between the regional and the global that is important. The question about the role of regions in world politics and how important they will remain I think is a difficult one to respond to, in part because regions and regional groupings have been challenged by a number of new forces. For example, by populism, by geopolitics, if you take a view, again, to go back to China, if you take the view that China is interested in connectivity rather than or alongside regionalism, there are various ways in which the regional project actually is under challenge at the moment. And again, I see, you know, you're going to say this is like a broken record here. I see a kind of hybrid system out there, actually, where you get a kind of you get the importance of regional relationships and regional groupings remains, but there are other forms of identity that are forming. Geopolitics, you know, is incredibly important in actually generating new ways of thinking about region in the Asia Pacific. You know, if you think about, you know, the Indo-Pacific concept, for example. So new forms of new ways of recasting regional groupings are occurring. And of course, there is this kind of populist nativist sentiment in many parts of the world, which is basically saying, you know, plague on all your houses, and we need to turn inwards and we need to think about domestic societies, not these interrelationships. And I see, again, these things as being very much in tension. And again, they will play out in different ways over the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. Rosemary, this has been fantastic, and I think we're out of time now, so we'll draw this seminar to a close. Just if my colleagues have any comments or anything they want to say, I just invite them at this point before I just thank Rosemary and sign off. Anything?
Well, I have one other question. Do we have time for just one more?
Of course.
Rosemary, this is something that we discussed before briefly, but I wonder if I can put this question to you in a slightly different formulation. The question about the relative balance of the explanatory factors of China's attempt to influence the discourse as an engaged participant and a stakeholder in the international institutional discourse versus the kind of the more materialist explanations for the shift in the global architecture that have to do with China's material largesse, really. I know that these are causal contributors that are very difficult to disentangle, but I wonder if I can put this to you as a counterfactual, just to gauge your reaction. So supposing that we have a state that doesn't quite have China's material presence on the world stage, but a state that pursues similar discursive strategies. And you can think, for example, of something like Russia, to harken back to an earlier question in terms of a return to a pluralist discourse and international system. Would we see a similar shift away from the solidarist discourse in the United Nations, or do you think that this is really more fundamentally a kind of a materialist story where, yes, there are multiple equilibria, so to speak, at the end of the road, and so discourse is important at that point, but the material factors are primary in ushering in some change?
I mean, as I said at the beginning, I'm not trying to disavow the role of material factors, but what I see happening, obviously, is the way in which those particular factors are interpreted by China itself and by states in the system. And how that actually means that very often China doesn't actually have to act, that it's actually in the kind of it's in the worldview of the interlocutor, that China is an important player in the system, and therefore I need to, think about what it wants, think about its positions on various issues, and think about its likely future role in my neighborhood or in a period of in an area of interest of importance to me, and so on. So it's a material story in that way, but it's what's so fascinating to me is the way in which China, as I say, doesn't really have to act. And that's partly because it gives you a particular narrative about what its increased power means, and ways of thinking about the world. I mean, I started with this rather ambitious idea that it can help to reconstitute what's meant by responsible state behavior and so on, in part because of the material story it can tell. But in order to be able to reconstitute, then other states in the system have to, again, kind of take on that particular framing that China has put out there in its discursive methods that it uses, and adapting their position, even though they're not actually necessarily always required to do so, you know, in any kind of direct. I suppose what I'm saying is the material story is one element of it, but it's too straightforward, essentially, and that there are interesting ways in which states, leaders of states, calculate their particular relationship with other states in the system, like China.
Thank you so much. Rosemary, this has been great. When I have thought about this book and listened to you today, it's found it just fascinating to think about our project, Reimagining World Order. And what we see in this case is China, not as you might think about a rising state trying to replace an existing order with a new system, a kind of Gilpin story of transition to a new order, a new hegemon. It's really much more about burrowing into existing international institutions and engaging in this kind of norm struggle.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting phenomenon. I don't know whether this is unique to China and this moment, or whether this has always been part of what the politics of international institutions has entailed, but it seems to be more profound in its in its politics today. China seems to be, as you report very eloquently, very systematic and purposive in its ideological normative exertions. So it's just a fascinating story, a kind of window into how world order circa 2020 may be evolving. And the kind of places you need to look to see the struggles as they unfold. Yeah. So this has been very illuminating for me, and I think for the other people who have been around the virtual table today. So thank you so much. And we hope to have you back. Our project will be, as you know, as a senior advisor to this project, you will be involved in other things as we go forward. So we look forward to your contributions in the next couple of years as well.
Thank you so much, John. I really look forward to engagement with your project, and I know that I'll derive enormous benefits from it. I mean, just talking to you and listening to you all tonight has been illuminating for me, and means I'll probably be awake all night thinking about some of the issues that were raised, but you know, that's the way it goes.
I guess that's a good sign, yes.
Yeah, it's good sign.
And thank you, Chika, thank you, Tolia, and thank you to the audience who we can't see. Stay tuned, visit our website. There'll be more things to do going forward.
Thank you. Bye.